Joe just gave it. It's KAZU, FM Pacific Grove, California. And the title of my broadcast is World Watchers, and it's program number 727, November the 11th, 1985. For local people here in the area, there are two broadcasts concerning Dan White and Harvey Milk and George Moscone this week on Channel 9 at 10 p.m. Tuesday, The People versus Dan White. That's a play that was on last year. I believe it's a repeat. It's a 1.5-hour documentary, and it is taken directly from the court records in San Francisco. Very interesting. And then the following evening, Wednesday, November 13th, from 9 to 11, is the Academy Award movie, The Times of Harvey Milk, and that sets the tone of San Francisco and the milieu of Dan White. Instead of doing part two on Dan White this evening, the mind control of Dan White, I thought it'd be more interesting for you to watch that and then share some more facts and information that are not in the movie or in the play. I've seen both of them, and then conclude the segments on Dan White. So I'm going to pick up where I left off, not last week, but the week before. That was a very complicated broadcast with a lot of names. It involved assassination teams, drug running, current arrests, and a lot of what look like separate items in the news that are connected to each other with various attorneys and modus operandi, cities, and agents that are related to each other, even though the stories break as separate subjects. And I ran through them very quickly to get an overview of some of those. There's about 12 or 14 major trials going on right now involving these people that I've been mentioning, in narcotics trials specifically, and murders and arrests. And I'm going to go slower over some of them and update some of the news for you regarding those people. Again, what has happened in the past 2 weeks since I mentioned their name. Before I do that, I just have to mention that the Wall Street Journal this morning had a story about Roy Cohn. There's been an effort to disbar him from the New York Bar Association, or maybe from other legal offices that he has in other states. And the Wall Street Journal said the disbarment proceedings against attorney Roy Cohn have been delayed for 2 months because he is dying. And they said he has 6 months to a year to live, so they're going to wait 2 months to disbar him when he'll be more dead than he is now. I had heard he was sick. He has a cancer, and Roy Cohn is very much part of the American history and the things that I talk about many times. The New York Daily News ran several articles just this past year on his high-profile counselor to organized crime and the large mafia arrests that took place in New York City this past year that are going to trial now, with Mr. Tommaso Buscetta as the main person helping the prosecution. A well-known mafia client of Roy Cohn's is one of the defendants in that pizza connection that links to the major crime families of New York City, and then, of course, to Italy and Milan, the Milan Mafia. And he's always been associated with the mobsters. The Torbett document refers to Roy Cohn in there. That's the unpublished manuscript of the assassination cabal of John Kennedy, and it goes into detail about Roy Cohn's work with General Medeiros, who currently is trying to get Nazi Rudolph back into this country, and Roy Cohn's relationship to NASA, to the Nazis from Germany, and his links to the Kennedy assassination. He is currently, I guess until he deceases, on the board of Western Goals. The head of that was the late Larry McDonald, the former head of the Birch Society, and that is the agency that was exposed for having their computers being fed information from the Los Angeles Police Department. It cost the LAPD $2.5 million settlement out of court to get off the hook on the trial there. So we never got a lot of the information out of that we should. And on the board with Roy Cohn there is Edward Teller, who is pushing the president to the brink of World War III with the Star Wars, the very person who has briefed Ronald Reagan since 1966 and who will blow the Geneva Conference. I want to do a lot on it, but I'm going to put it over for a while because nothing will be achieved, so there's no use talking about it too much now. And all of you remember Roy Cohn is the chief counsel for Senator Joe McCarthy, the Senate witch hunt. I call it the witch hunt subcommittee, helping blacklist people throughout this country, and he has had a high profile with Ronald Reagan's team, which includes Mr. William Casey of the CIA and Paul Laxalt, Senator Laxalt, who raised the money for the GOP for 2 elections, with his Las Vegas connections to modalities, to the mafia. Of course, Las Vegas is, the power structure is practically all mafia run there. And the role of Roy Cohn in this administration has been linked to the mafia, the drug running, and the assassination teams, the undercurrent of what's been going on in the Reagan administration and Reagan's past ever since he got into politics. Now, the one other article I just want to mention before I go on to the subject of guns, drugs, and murder is an example of the craziness that's going on in Washington, D.C. at the current time. I have approximately about 75 articles in a lump called one-liners. I don't know how to deal with them. They're so crazy, and I just thought I'd share one of those with you to show how difficult the problem of selection is. Just this morning in the Monterey Herald and Wire Service story, the government is on the brink of default for the first time in American history. The government is in an impasse because there's no money in the bank to meet their financial obligations. And if people working or paid by the government for Social Security or whatever, millions of dollars of checks might be bouncing in federal checks, and they may have to send 500,000 people, non-essential workers, home immediately on what they call is a vacation, because the government is, according to the newspapers, and we've seen this going on, is being brought to the brink of double doomsday. They can't get a budget. They're out of money for the first time in the history of the United States, and Ronald Reagan was the one who was going to balance the budget. And then the Wall Street Journal this morning, just parallel to that, is a story. Senate defense bill has over $2 billion for items that the Pentagon never asked for. Now, the Pentagon is a voracious eater of money. It asks for more and more and settles for what you cut back. But in the current budget that they're wrangling about, there is $2 billion that no one ever asked for. Well, we know somebody put it on the books. It obviously is a way for the Pentagon to fund the Contras. When Congress says the CIA can't do it, then it goes to the Defense Department. And they use an example of an appropriation of $400 million for ammunition that the Army didn't even request on the books. It says the Army needs this extra ammunition, and the Armed Services is saying we have nowhere to store the stockpile of ammunition that you're buying. So on paper, it's supposed to be bullets, and they don't even have a place to put it. But then the article continues, the Wall Street Journal, it says the measure would provide an unrequested $56.2 million for research into acquired immune deficiency syndrome, which is AIDS. What does the Pentagon have to use $56 million when the hospitals and the centers of the universities and the research centers, the lay people should be staying with their hands in the medical field? This is identical to Nazi Germany, where I.G. Farben controlled the medicine, and the Gestapo is equivalent to the Pentagon. The Pentagon is asking for $52.6 million for their version of research when there's a lot of reason to believe that they started it in the first place. And then they're asking $67.6 million to test members of the armed services for AIDS. $67 million to test the military for AIDS, and $100 million for counterterrorism. That doesn't include the embassies, where there's several billion into that. Millions of dollars that nobody requested. And of course, this goes into spying money and subterfuge. There is a budget here that Washington, D.C. can't handle. On the other hand, they're saying they get money that nobody asked for, which is many millions of dollars. Now, as I say, on broadcast 725, 2 weeks ago, I went into a lot of various areas. If I repeat them now and update them, the names may become familiar with you. I was talking about the death of Bekir Celenk, who was killed in Turkey, a primary witness to both the drug running and the guns traffic, the smuggling of arms and weapons, the exchange of drugs and guns with violence in the Middle East, atomic bombs for the Middle East. That links to the Masonic Lodge, the P2, Bekir Celenk, a primary witness in that trial, the Milan Mafia, and out of Palermo, Italy, and also he's a connecting link to the allegations that Agca said he had a role in trying to arrange for the murder of the Pope, where the evidence seems to be pointing to Michael Ledeen and Claire Sterling and Paul Hentze and Alexander Haig and the CIA, who really set that up. And I talked about the murder of Emmanuel Orlando, whose father works in the Vatican, who they wanted to trade her for Agca. And when Agca wasn't traded, the people who kidnapped her, the Grey Wolves, the Nazi group, out of Italy and Germany and Turkey said, well, they would kill her, and said they had. And I ran down various deaths. I'll update those deaths for you now. And the drug dealers, the arrest of a Mr. Barrett in Phoenix, Arizona from Las Vegas, and Robert Franklin Black, who was arrested in Seattle, and then the arrest of the RAJNEEsh in South Carolina, and Sheila in Germany. And I'm going back over those names now and tie them in with what's happened in the news, some of the names that I ran down before. Now, one of the people in the drugs, and it links to the Defense Department, to the CIA, and narcotics traffic I mentioned was Paul Sjeklocha. He lives up in Palo Alto, San Jose, and he was arrested for sending weapons, planning to send weapons to Iran, working with members of organized crime, Jimmy Fratriano and Tony Romano. And he has links, as I say, to the CIA, the Defense Department, and to David Atty Phillips, who was responsible for the CIA action when Salvador Allende was killed. And Phillips, of course, is deep into the survivalist movement, the Eagle magazine, and the co-partner of the Survivalists with this Paul Sjeklocha, the common denominator for the mass murders up at Calaveras County. These two parties, Carolyn Balzas and her drug dealer, Wayne Greener, and his murders are linked to Paul Sjeklocha. Common attorney Chris Carroll and Stan Rosansky represent both of them. Now, this past week, the San Jose Mercury ran a story about Paul Sjeklocha's trial, and he's suing the federal government because he claims that the organized crime syndicate, Anthony, Tony Romano, and Angelo Maldonado, set him up for the weapons and the tanks that were to go to Iran, the anti-tank missiles. Romano's name came up in regards to the mayor of San Francisco, Mayor Alioto, and the trials that went on regarding his alleged relationships with Romano. And when Joe Alioto was out, George Moscone, the controversial Moscone, took his place. And Sjeklocha is suing the federal government. He's filed a suit that they were setting him up with the drugs shipments, not the drug shipments, with the weapons and the missiles to Iran, the tanks, the TOW missiles. And one of the defendants in his suit is U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Wayne Gillespie. So he's blaming the organized crime syndicate in messing over his life, a man who worked for the CIA and the Defense Department. And in comes the Mafia. And last week I mentioned his relationship to Jimmy Fratriano, Jimmy the Weasel Fratriano, who in turn has close links down to Modalis and La Costa. And those are the Paul Axalt, Ronald Reagan connections to organized crime in California. I have an article, March 16th, 1980. There's many articles about Fratriano, and I have books about him and books written by him, his biography. But it's just an example of the kind of character he has. He was testifying at a trial in 1980 in San Francisco and telling how he took part in at least 2 murders while he was working for the FBI. So if you think these murders are separate from, or these mafia aren't involved in mass murders and gun running and drug smuggling, he was saying 5 years ago how he did 2 murders while being paid by the FBI, how he participated in 5 other murders, and he had knowledge of 9 murders, and he was a witness, part of the FBI federal system, and he was testifying about the Cosa Nostra running the Teamsters. And Jackie Presser, who was arrested this year, got off because it turned out he said he was an FBI agent, and the Teamsters were this past week, were in the news where Mr. Williams said they knew who killed Jimmy Hoffa and who he was with, and also part of the news stories that have been breaking. The man who killed Jimmy Hoffa was then hired by Raymond Donovan, Secretary of Labor, and his trial's just crawling along in New York City. He was appointed Secretary of Labor because he obliged by working constantly with the Teamsters and getting rid of Hoffa, paying off the man who did it, hiring him, and then this is the only labor union that supported Richard Nixon and then Ronald Reagan. These are the strong supporters. You see pictures of Jackie Presser and Raymond Donovan, Ronald Reagan, and forget Nixon. We're talking about this administration with this track record of murders. And again, now Mr. Sjeklocha is tangled with Romano and Fratriano in 1985. Now, I was talking about another survivalist in addition to Carolyn Blazas. Their names are so bizarre. We've got a lot of Yugoslavian, Polish names in these things. I have to scratch my head. There are attorneys and the people involved. But another survivalist, Kenneth Don Barrett, I ran through stories about him 2 weeks ago. He robbed a armored car in Las Vegas. He shot a policeman on the LAPD staff in Nevada. Then he went to Phoenix, Arizona, and when the FBI closed in on him and wanted to arrest him, or so they said, they did arrest him, they killed the FBI woman that was working with the agents in Phoenix, Arizona. And there was an article in the newspaper, October 28th, 1985, FBI covers up homicide. And it says the FBI female special agent assigned to the Phoenix, Arizona office, Robin Ahrens, was shot down and killed by two male agents from the same office where she worked, where they were staking out a crime scene. Now, the woman from Arizona of the FBI was shot by two people who had been doing work for her for months on the case, so they couldn't confuse the identity or if they used disguise as her. But who survived? The survivalist, the bank robber, the man who shot the policeman, who had the cache of stolen weapons, the survivalist equipment, large caliber pistols, ammunition, M16 rifle, silencers, mace, gas mask, bayonet, you name it. And he uses these various things, and he's alive, and the FBI woman was gunned down. And one article that was printed asked what is the relationship of her information there to FBI agent Dan Mitrione. And I briefly touched on it and ran through it because there are so many names in these cases. And just this last week in the New York Times, there was a story on Dan Mitrione. He's the son of the chief of police in Uruguay who taught torture to the Uruguayan government, who was trained in the United States at the police academies. His son has been an FBI agent in Miami for 20 years, and he was caught with heavy narcotics traffic. And one of the deals he was working with, interestingly enough, Mitrione's son, was in Dallas with the Dallas Cowboys, where in 1980 they were buying cocaine in exchange for blowing the game so that the syndicate and the mob could make high bets on the Dallas Cowboys on the other team, knowing they were going to win. And in exchange, they gave the players cocaine to lose the game. And Daniel Mitrione Jr., the son of the man doing the torturing in Uruguay, who worked with Joseph Mengele, Klaus Barbie, and the drug traffickers down in that part of the world, he wrote up papers about the men who owned the Cowboys. That was Mr. Murchison, heavily involved in the Kennedy assassination. It was his home the night before Kennedy was killed. The J. Edgar Hoover and Richard Nixon were there deciding whether to do the fatal shot the next day. And then the Cowboys was sold to Bum Bright, who owns it now in Texas, who paid 1/3 of the ad that Bernard Weissman put in the newspaper the day that Kennedy was killed, the wanted for treason for John Kennedy, and H.L. Hunt paid for another part of it, or Nelson Bunker Hunt, and the Birch Society that Larry McDonald and Roy Cohn are part of. Larry McDonald, certainly the president of it, worked hand in glove, of course, with Bum Bright and Murchison. So the Birch Society, the Kennedy assassination, comes in surreptitiously in various stories, like this arrest of the Mr. Barrett in Phoenix, Arizona, and the murder of the FBI woman who was on to the connections of this case. Now, I mentioned 2 weeks ago about the BHAGWAN. I have so many articles, the RAJNEESH BHAGWAN or the BHAGWAN RAJNEESH. I turn it around to be funny. The order is the BHAGWAN Shrey RAJNEESH. And I talked about the drug connections, the arrest of a Robert Franklin Black, very important cocaine dealer, wanted for 10 years, involved with international drug smuggling since the late 60s, had a charge in 1977 with passport fraud, 1977 cocaine smuggling in San Diego, 1984 currency smuggling, 1984 drug conspiracy. He was arrested just 3 weeks before the BHAGWAN takes a powder and tries to get down to the Bahamas, where there's plenty of that coke and drug stuff, and he found two places that would let him take refuge, and one was Bermuda or the Bahamas. He wanted to be down there, and he was on his way, and he was stopped in South Carolina. Now, just when the drug connection was breaking, and it seems that the authorities knew all the while that this particular Robert Franklin Black had information that he was in and out with the RAJNEESH and kept an Indian name and several other aliases. Just when that happened, Sheila took off to go to Germany. And this is a very important thing I had on the air, and I want to repeat it because of another news item that came out just this week. To replace Sheila, Big Mouth Sheila, who went off to Germany, Prem Hasha took her place. And I told you that Prem Hasha was Francois Ruddy. She's now the president of the RAJNEESH Foundation, the international multi-million-dollar corporation. And I gave you her background. She was trained in the Israeli army. She was over there, then to Canada, where she then married a Mr. Glazer, who helped build Atomic Energy Commission at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And there were 4 friends that she mentioned in the Oregonian that she was familiar with in an interview that, as the wife of Mr. Glazer, she was associated with. One was Wernher von Braun, who's listed in the Torbett document as part of the Permindex operation with Walter Dornberger and Mr. Medeiros and Roy Cohn in killing John Kennedy. Hyman Rickover, who's been in the scandals recently with General Dynamics. Henry Crown and General Dynamics played a major role in the Kennedy assassination. Estes Kivauber, she knew. He was murdered because he was investigating Carlos Marcello and the drug connections with Robert Kennedy in Congress. That fell short. After Robert Kennedy was killed and Kefauver was through, nobody ever touched the drug connections again. And then Howard Baker was another member of the Senate that she cited, and Howard Baker was the liaison to Richard Nixon at the time of Watergate to keep the lid on the murders that were taking place and the drug connections and the international death squad connections of Watergate to Richard Nixon, to keep the lid on all that. So she produced the movie, her money, a lot of it, with Mr. Ruddy, The Godfather, Francis Ford Coppola's movie, The Godfather, which is all fitting to where she is now and what's going on. But just to update her and go one step further, October the 29th, 1985, the BHAGWAN was arrested down in South Carolina, and the Seattle Times ran stories. Sheila in Germany was saying that he was involved with drug abuse and drug traffic. She was citing the drug connections. And there's been talk and articles for the past 2 or 3 years on the cocaine, heroin, hashish, and marijuana of the BHAGWAN, the drug traffic that supplied the money for his Rolls Royces and his operation. He was charging the BHAGWAN with these things from Germany when she was arrested, and he was charging her with murder, illegal wiretapping, attempted murder, and they've been accusing each other of names. Now, a very important break in that story of the BHAGWAN came this week out of the Oregonian. It's November the 7th. BHAGWAN has returned to Oregon after a stopover in South Carolina and Oklahoma, where the charges were dropped for trying to flee the country. And his attorney, his top legal advisor at the RAJNEESH ranch there, a man who uses the Indian name Prem Niran, he's the advisor to the RAJNEESH, the current on-base attorney, married to a woman from Chile, from Pinochet's Chile, and several of the top advisors are from South Africa and Chile and Germany and Canada, an amazing combination. He was speaking for the fact that RAJNEESH was back, and they hired 4 attorneys to represent these various charges of wiretapping, of attempted murder, of illegal immigration, faking his immigration papers, marriage by subterfuge to stay in the area, and possible drugging, the salmonella poisoning, and so forth. So they hired 4 attorneys now to represent the RAJNEESH. The chains are off of his hands and arms. And one of them is Miles Ambrose of Washington, D.C., AMBROSE, former Commissioner of Customs, according to the Oregonian, and U.S. Attorney Brian O'Neill of Los Angeles. Now, the interesting thing about Ambrose in the article in the Oregonian, they identified him as a former Commissioner of Customs. But as soon as I saw the name, I nearly went through the ceiling and went to the first book I could think of, remembering that the reason I thought the RAJNEESH and Sheila fled was the drug arrest of Robert Franklin Black that tipped it off, wanted for 10 years and part of their outfit. I went to the book, The Great Heroin Coup. Many of you have it, and if you don't, you should get it. And, of course, in the index, it describes Mr. Ambrose in this way. In the early 1980s, the Justice Department is investigating allegations that Carlos Marcello had hired Mario Noto, the Deputy Commissioner of Immigration, a guaranteed plush job after his retirement in return for Noto's help in getting Marcello's travel restrictions lifted. Noto's attorney was Miles Ambrose, who stepped down from his job as the head of BNDD, that's the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, in the wake of a corruption allegations. That was from the New York Times, February the 11th, 1980. Well, they didn't go into the details of that, but again, Carlos Marcello was involved in saying there is a stone in my shoe, a pebble in my shoe, Robert Kennedy put there, and those were the orders to kill Robert Kennedy. And Carlos Marcello worked with Jack Ruby and David Ferry and Clay Shaw in New Orleans. And again, the assassination team, the attorney for Marcello and Noto, turns out to be Ambrose. But then the book, The Great Heron Coup, just to cite one, and I can go through many books of Ambrose, but I think you can get the whole picture when you realize in this one book, Great Heron Coup, chapter 17, White House Hanky-Panky, when Richard Nixon wanted to set up his office regarding narcotics matters and using his Special Action Office for Drug Abuse Prevention as a special assassination team with murderers that tied to death squads down in South America that does link to Mengele and Klaus Barbie down in South America. He set up the White House plumbers team that set off the whole Watergate story in the first place, if you remember. And the White House plumbers team involved John Caulfield from New York City and Miles Ambrose, the former customs commissioner who was named head of the narcotics campaign. He would leave later the government service in disgrace. He had a lot of disgraces. He's a crook. He's been hired by the BHAGWAN, which is really fitting. You know, as I always say with David Emery and I say, what goes around comes around. So this seedy operation of the RAJNEEsh brings in Miles Ambrose with all of his links to G. Gordon Liddy, E. Howard Hunt, and Hunt's connections to the CIA, to the trained Cuban exiles, to Santo Traficante and the Cuban Mafia, which again is heavy narcotics traffic. He set up this group with Lucien Cohn of the CIA, of David Young, who was from the staff of Henry Kissinger. Always Henry Kissinger's involved. And there's one description in this book about the team that Ambrose had. The White House controlled narcotics intelligence at home and abroad. Nixon's staff sought to control and enforce it itself. They needed a strike force, for in January 72, the White House set up the Office for Drug Abuse and Law Enforcement, according to a plan conceived by G. Gordon Liddy. That was the avowed Nazi Hitler lover, in case you've forgotten, and it would be headed by Miles Ambrose, the same attorney that is now going for the RAJNEEsh and trying to help him with his problems. And this story tells about their record in Texas and their gun running and their narcotics traffic. And Odell, those were the initials for the agency, was so notorious for its record of illegal raids, no-knock entries into private homes, and beating of innocent people, they called it the American Gestapo. Now, that's just a few words on the background of the attorney who's going to be representing the RAJNEEsh. And the interesting thing, you see, is by having this woman, Francois Ruddy, and forget her Indian name that she assumes, or you can use it if you want, but coming in to the BHAGWAN's operation, she's talking, has produced a movie called The Godfather. Nixon was the Godfather during the Watergate periods for sure. Martha Mitchell got a needle in her butt for saying the mafia is in the White House, and 3 years later she was dead. And in this case, the Godfather of the RAJNEEsh group, Ambrose, is going out to represent him. He has a big following all over the world, particularly in Germany. So what goes around comes around. She produced The Godfather once, and she brings Ambrose for The Godfather the second time. And I think her connections in Los Angeles, this is important because her connections with her ex-husband, Mr. Glazer, and that's where she pulled in her big bucks to begin with. He's one of the largest fundraisers for Ronald Reagan. I think I mentioned that before. He's the man that Reagan sees on the West Coast along with these other, well, what should I call them? I can use some phrases, but I better clean it up. But he's important to Reagan's administration, and who else would better serve the RAJNEEsh with that drug arrest up in Vancouver and the following around them than to bring in Mr. Miles Ambrose with his links to death squads, to Hunt and Liddy, to Carlos Marcello. You can tell what kind of a case is developing as they hire their particular attorneys. Now, interestingly enough, we'll take a 1-minute break, and I'll do some more about the RAJNEEsh and go back to articles in the news this week to pertain to the people that I mentioned on program 725. It went fast, I admit it, and I took a lot of names, and I will be going over them and updating them as we go along. But we'll take a 1-minute break now. printed sheets with bibliography. Sources of information are available. You can write to me, P.O. Box 22511, Carmel 93922, or you can telephone, and I will give you information how. If you missed the first half or the first 14 years, I'll tell you how you can catch up. Now, the Oregonian had an interesting story about the governor of Oregon. His name is Vic Atty, Atiyyeh. He comes from the Middle East, interestingly enough, of Arab descent. And October, they asked him, what do you think about the BHAGWAN's arrest in North Carolina? He was interviewed in the Oregonian about that. And he said, well, we expected it. It was just what we planned to do. He left Oregon to go to Taiwan October the 18th and stayed there October 18th to 25th, where Taiwan and the head of the World Anti-Communist League and the Kuomintang and the son of Chiang Kai-shek have a very big part in the drugs that these people had in India and were trafficking and in South America and come to the United States. And coincidentally, then he went from Taiwan October 25th to November the 1st to no other place but Damascus, Syria, which plays such a big role in the Bolivian trial now. Romeo Tumo, Tommaso Buscetta, they're from Syria, the drug connections to Syria, the drug running that Celenk was involved with, all coincidental, incidentally. But the time the BHAGWAN was going to be picked up and Chile picked up and the drug arrest in Vancouver, the governor of Oregon says, oh, I happened to be away. I was a week in Taiwan and a week in Syria. And if you've listened to me long enough, you know that there are very few coincidences. And I just put it on the back burner and watch it cook a while, and it cooks. In the Oregonian, a year and a half ago, February 84, there was a story about the police department in Portland, Oregon. And I had on the air a woman named Annette Jollin, Jollin, and her father, Manfred Schreiber, was visiting her. And she is studying with the chief of police in Oregon, in Portland. And Manfred was the chief of police in Munich, Germany, when the terrorist activity, according to the Oregonian, disrupted the summer games in Munich, Germany. They don't say when 7 Israeli athletes were murdered. They said the game was disrupted. That's a way of letting history erase the fact of who was killed at that game. But her father was in charge of security at Munich, and she's in Portland, Oregon, as the first chairwoman of the Portland Police Internal Investigation Committee. And her daddy is now police chief in Bonn, Germany, and the BHAGWAN and Chile and RAJNEESH have a large group in Bonn, Germany. I'm sure it's just coincidental. They don't know each other at all. But Mr. Schreiber was visiting her in Oregon, and his daughter has a big part in the Oregon police. And when the BHAGWAN's money goes, it's a lot of it comes from Germany and goes to Germany. Now, another newspaper article this week, October 25th, says BHAGWAN and the Green Party tied to drug running. And it mentions this fellow that was arrested, Mr. Black, in Vancouver, as I say, when they split, and he's now in Seattle. He's a fugitive in this conspiracy of drugs and guns and currency leaving. He spent many years, 3 years, the last 3 years at Antelope Valley, in and out, with his operations. In 1983, Petra Kelly of the Green Party from Germany and Rudolf Barrow and Gerd Bastian were at the compound with the RAJNEESH, and they also linked up with the Sufi cult, including the Ananda Marga. Now, I'll do more on Ananda Marga. That is the Nazi group that came out of India, and BHAGWAN has been linked to those Nazis in India before he left the ashram there and came to Oregon, and has been linked to a lot of interconnecting areas that overlap, but several articles have put him directly with Nazis from Germany. And so it's interesting that a big hunk of his funds, just as the Jonestown funds, come from Germany at the present time. Now, this Petra Kelly's been very controversial. Her presence in Israel was the cause of a lot of riots, accusing of her relationship with Nazis, and a member of the Green Party who founded it was part of the Nazis during Hitler's time. And also, I have an article that she was staying at a convent in Germany when Joseph Mengele was there. He had stayed there as a safe house while he attended the funeral of his father, and then went back down to Sao Paulo, Brazil. But it's interesting, the connection of the Green Party to the drug dealer who was arrested just at the time that these two broke up. He was running out of the country. The BHAGWAN and Sheila went to Germany. Another story about the RAJNEESH in the papers this week. about the charges for murder, attempted murder. There are 9 people that they were going to kill. But the story runs, and this is another typical story, BHAGWAN, RAJNEESH former secretary, and 3 associates used false identification to buy guns in Texas for the assassination plot to kill 9 people in Oregon. They go to New York City with a false ID. They go to Texas to pick up these secure weapons that can't be traced. John Hinckley went to Texas to get the gun when he shot Ronald Reagan. Mark David Chapman got to Texas to get a gun when he shot John Lennon. And the RAJNEEsh go to Texas. Don't know if it's the same gun shop, but they had special identification from New York City to Texas, bought guns, 5 pistols, and they were setting up safe houses in Oregon and also around the world where the assassins would stay after they had shot these people in Oregon. Several of them were prosecutors against the RAJNEEsh when they moved there. One gentleman, a Mr. Turner, Charles Turner, U.S. attorney, was to be killed. They planned that 3 or 4 women would kill him in a scheme. They would stage a car breakdown. He had a road that went from the city hall to a country road. They would stake that out and shoot him and use the women. They have rifle practice there that were the best shots. And then another person to be killed was Leslie Zaitz, 30 years old, a reporter, part of a 4-person team who spent 13 months writing that series of articles in the Oregonian that I said were so brilliant, called For Love or Money. And if the plan succeeded, the women would use international network of RAJNEEsh communes to hide their killers, all set up. And the primary assassin, as I say, would be a woman, but they didn't plan to kill everybody by shooting them. Some were going to be poisoned, and it tells how they would do it, and also poisons on salad bars to cause salmonella and other poisons. So they have the technology to put people in safe houses. They have the training for the shooting. And this is more than just a religious cult and always has been. And just as Jonestown had assassins that fled, killed various people that wouldn't suicide, take it themselves, and so forth. The story how the RAJNEEsh was foiled in flight, that's what it's called, from the San Jose Mercury. And interestingly enough, one of the tip-offs, when he called to get an airplane, he charged it to his American Express card for $12,000 and then needed the American Express from New Jersey to get another clearance. And all the while, the United States government had been flying over their place and staking them out for a long time. And the sudden departure without the cash right on hand, he had $54,000 in cash, but he needed to put something on his credit card to get the plane and use the American Express. He doesn't leave home without it. And I might have mentioned on a program that Rolf Mengele used the American Express card when he went down to visit his daddy in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And on the board of American Express are Gerald Ford from the Warren Commission, who concealed the murders of John Kennedy, and Henry Kissinger. And maybe these agents have a special number they use that they can get through with their American Express card. I'll be doing more on the BHAGWAN, the wiretapping, and so forth, but I just want to update some more articles pertaining to their relationship to other drug problems. Now, I mentioned the importance of Bekir Celenk, that primary witness that was murdered in Turkey, but the drug trials that he would tap into are going on anyway. One is in Italy, where huge numbers of people have been murdered, and this is for trafficking, drug trafficking, gun running. And Rossano Brazzi, Ronald Reagan's friend and actor, he recently was in the series, The Movies on India, and he was the star of the movie The South Pacific. He's one of the defendants among many in that trial. And in New York City, among Roy Cohn's friends and G. Robert Blakey's friends, there's a team of people being prosecuted, a drug team that is going on at the present time. And the primary connection between the New York Mafia drug arrest and the Italian drug arrest, the common man, is Tommaso Buscetta. And I also mentioned 2 weeks ago the drug connections, the heavy amount of cocaine that was picked up in Paraguay not too long ago that Jack Anderson wrote about, and the chemicals that came from Germany to process that they won't turn over. Now, the interesting thing about the trial that's going on, Mr. Buscetta was working with a particular agent, and he tells about his relationship with him in Sao Paulo, Brazil. The defendant, his name is Gaetano Badalamenti, and how they were involved with heavy mafia drug traffic out of Sao Paulo, Brazil. This is the Mengele connection of Klaus Barbie and Mengele to Sao Paulo, Brazil. The CIA had documents, heavy supporting evidence in 1979 of Mengele's cocaine traffic out of Sao Paulo, Brazil. And I said that was the date that they said they had to bury him officially because he was linked through these documents to these other top Nazis. So at the trial in New York, Mr. Buscetta is talking about his friend and their mafia connections through the pizzas in New York, the pizzerias, and New Jersey, Pennsylvania, to the Midwest, and also the common denominator between all this goes to Syria also, the drug connections from Italy and South America into the United States, and these trials are just bursting with information. Now, I got a book, a listener to World Watchers called me about a week and a half ago and asked me if I had the book, The Last Nazi, Joseph Mengele. And I didn't have it, so he sent it right down to me the next day. And it's written by Donald Fine. It just came out, and I'm sure Tom Davis at Research will be carrying it. And I opened to some very interesting pages that just about tie up a lot of the material that I've been expressing and sharing with you as, again, separate stories which have common denominators in them. Now, Sao Paulo, Brazil, has a population of 12 million inhabitants. But do you realize that one man was the attorney for three very important people out of Sao Paulo, Brazil? And this book talks about them. The attorney's name is Flavio Marx, and he is the gentleman who represents Mr. and Mrs. Bossert. The Bosserts were contacted by the Nazi Odessa movement to house Joseph Mengele at their home. They had a secret attic that I felt was a possible place, and I mentioned on the air, for even putting Adolf Hitler, and I want to go more into that story, but the Bosserts were hired Mr. Flavio Marx as their attorney at the time that the Mengele story was breaking. Mrs. Bossert was the one who was faking the crying so the coroner, nobody would open the box, and Mr. Bossert was the man who was supposed to be swimming with Mengele in 1979, and they put him into that grave, and they protected him and put him into the grave. And this book talks about the Bosserts hiring Flavio Marx. Now, another client Mr. Marx had was Nazi Gustav Wagner. I've done endless broadcasts on him because the information and headlines in Brazil at the time Wagner was arrested said that he was with Adolf Hitler. They were right in the newspapers in Brazil. If you want to send down there, I have the name of the newspapers, and I've been wanting to send for this for a long, long time. Wagner was a man allegedly wanted by Simon Wiesenthal, who lost his interest in him. 4 countries wanted him. He was one of the most notorious Nazi war criminals. His attorney, Mr. Marx, was such a good attorney. Wagner was never deported. He was wanted by Germany, Austria, Israel. As I say, I've mentioned him many times on the air. He was arrested the night of Adolf Hitler's birthday party. His identity was confirmed, and he was protected by Romeo Tumo, the same police chief that cooked up this Joseph Mengele corpse story, and he never was extradited to Germany, so he had a very good attorney. And, of course, the Bosserts aren't going to be charged with anything. They have a very good attorney. But there's another man out of the area who also was represented by Mr. Marx, none other than the Sicilian mafioso Tommaso Buscetta. So what we have is one man representing. Now, Buscetta is not going to get bad charges. He's going to be the squealer for the first time, breaking the mafia bonds in Italy and in New York City. So they're cutting a deal. And I know it has to do with Mengele and Barbie, and I've said over and over again, Barbie's trial, DeLorean's trial can't go on until they're sure that Mengele is really tucked away, and he isn't tucked away, and they're stalling these various trials and hoping maybe they'll die in the meantime and they won't have to go through it. So the important mafioso Tommaso Buscetta, who worked out of Sao Paulo, Brazil, is represented by the same attorney as Wagner had and the Bosserts have. And as I say, with 20 million people in the city, it's really hard to believe how they could find the same attorney, but I just discovered that in the book this week. Another story in this book, it says there was good reason to be wary of the story 1985 that Mengele was dead. Mr. Luke remembered a dead Joseph Mengele in Paraguay. He was buried, and later they dug it out, and he turned out to be a Czechoslovakian doctor. Mr. Ernstein said he killed Mengele in Brazil in 1960, and in 1970, there was a report that came out of Paraguay that Mengele had died, and then they dug it up, and the corpse had the name Flores. The Institute of German-Paraguay Relations reported Mengele's demise in Bolivia in 1976, but they said they had to cremate the body, and then there was a report that the missing man had gone to Portugal and committed suicide. So he had a lot of burials. And this book, The Last Nazi, says that they got a promise from Fritz Steinecker, who defended a number of war criminals, that he would inform the authorities when his client died. And I was the one who smoked out Steinecker through the Wiesenthal Institute, through a continuous radio program sending information to the FBI in Detroit regarding DeLorean and Steinecker, that this money went into Mengele's account. And the last sound of Steinecker was that he wouldn't admit or say that Mengele is dead. And his name is in this book in relationship to the what was going down at digging up the grave, and he has not yet announced that he is dead. Incidentally, this book, they call it The Last Nazi, which is hardly true. They mention the fact that Romeo Tuma, the police chief down in Sao Paulo, said that the Odessa, the Nazi network that I refer to often, the Odessa network, was a strong body of Nazis in South America that had a link working together, and that it funded the Bosserts and Joseph Mengele while he was down in South America. And a rabbi, believe it or not, a rabbi from Brazil, Sao Paulo, Brazil, made Mr. Romeo Tuma, the police chief of Sao Paulo, retract the statement that there was no Odessa. This is, if you don't believe it, and it's hard to believe except if you've studied these rabbis, page 210, Romeo Tuma backed off from his affirmation of an Odessa. Rabbi Sobel was dubious of a structured conspiratorial network. Instead, he talked of Brazil's traditional ethnic harmony and its tolerance for ideological viewpoints. And incidentally, at the temple that my father was so much a part of, and literally 65 years there, I've mentioned a German rabbi who came, who just resigned. He retired under circumstances that was a forced retirement, which I won't share on the air. My mother's 92. When she passes away, I'll tell you about Wilshire Boulevard Temple, because the German rabbi that came over from Germany and was at that temple for quite a few years from the end of the war, went to rabbinical school, and then Wilshire Boulevard Temple, he's now replaced by a rabbi, Baruch, from Brazil, from Rio de Janeiro. And I was asking him, I haven't met him. I talked to him on the telephone and asked him about the Nazis in South America and so forth. And he's very casual about it. And he said, well, we know they're there and they know we're there and we all get along. And he said, who are you, reporter or investigator? And I'm sure the other three rabbis told him, good and well, wait till you meet Mae Brussell. I'm sure he was forewarned, but I was kind of sounding him out. So Rabbi Sobel from Sao Paulo, Brazil, is saying there's no such Odessa. And it's like Simon Wiesenthal saying there's no Martin Bormann who's alive. And Klaus Barbie came out with a book that I heard about this week that's being published. It's out in Canada now, saying that Martin Bormann is very much alive and that he did his dealings with him. And various people in the jails in New York City know, and in Germany, in the drug traffic, know that Mengele and Bormann and Barbie all were connected. It was February 27th, 1985, that the CIA documents came out that Mengele was involved with this drug traffic, and that's what began the scramble to dig up the bones at that cemetery that were carefully placed for the time that anybody would catch on what's going on. Now, the DeLorean trial has been stalled, and I haven't updated that with you, the Detroit trial, and another book came out, interesting book called Hard Driving by Mr. Haddad, and William Haddad, Random House, 1985. And I have been saying for 3 years the tie-in of John DeLorean, the cocaine that was in the hotel at the airport in Los Angeles, outside the airport, that came from Klaus Barbie that went through Mr. Fritz Steinecker to the bank account of Mengele. Now, Barbie may always have put money into Mengele's account, the drug traffic money into the Swiss accounts. DeLorean may not know where Barbie put the cash that he got for the cocaine that William Hetrick picked up. Let's say he didn't know, but alongside John DeLorean, ever since he got tangled in this web, immediately came Gordon Novell from the Permindex operation described in the Torbett document. Novell of Permindex, co-worker with Henry Crown, General Dynamics, Carlos Marcello, John Medeiros, Roy Cohn. Interesting that at this time he travels everywhere with him and is like the babysitter, blew the case for John DeLorean. So he got off the cocaine case in Los Angeles by writing to the jury and the press conferences. and so forth. And incidentally, the attorney, Mr. Weitzman, who represented DeLorean, is representing Kathy Smith in Los Angeles, and the Belushi murder trial goes nowhere. She tells how she murdered him, tapes how she murdered him, and you don't hear a word out of that. A little more of the cocaine and heroin from this gang. But the DeLorean book, Hard Driving, I just want to cite a few quotations to show you the direction that the books are coming out about DeLorean. The first three were puff pieces, and you get a little bit of information, but William Haddad is a little more knowledgeable. In fact, he was a speechwriter for John Kennedy, and he worked with Estes Kefauver, and he's been in the Washington scene for a long time, so he's a different element. When he writes his book about DeLorean, he's bringing out different points than these PR men who want to take him from city to city as Mr. Charmer. You never hear anything political about John DeLorean, and when he was first arrested, there was enough to do 10 consecutive hours about it, and luckily I saved all of it and separated, but now some other pieces are coming out. Now, just a few quotations. On page 27, it tells when John DeLorean was working at General Motors. In mid-'74, John had established the John Z. DeLorean Corporation in Detroit, and for a time he worked out of Bunky Knudsen's office. He had consulting contracts that he claimed were worth over $3 million. He was giving advice. The fees came from Allstate Insurance, which is Sears Roebuck, and the head of Sears formed the American Security Council. I've been wanting to do broadcasts on the links of that group to the murder of John Kennedy. W.R. Grace, the shipping company, the Ryder Systems, a trucking concern, and Renault Car. Now, interesting enough, John DeLorean bought into the San Diego Chargers at a time where they were all accused of cocaine trafficking and not trafficking, but using. I don't know if they distributed it, but they used it. And then he sold his 8% share of that to Baron Hilton. Baron Hilton is a sovereign military knight of Malta out of the Vatican. J. Peter Grace is the American representative of the Knights of Malta in the United States, the military branch of the Vatican. And I had read that DeLorean, before he pulled up with the born-again Christian, was at St. Patrick's in New York City every day that he was in New York City, and he had close relationship with Cardinal Cook, who made a quick demise of one of these quick Jack Ruby cancers when John DeLorean was arrested. Another section of the book, it says one of the consulting accountants, W.R. Grace, paid $25,000 a month to DeLorean. They were going to build recreational vehicles, but he didn't make them. DeLorean got the money anyway. Grace was reported to spend $1 million on the project. There was a mock-up that was never built, so that was money for DeLorean's pocket. Well, Grace and the Grace family, of course, are described in the book The Cottage in the Room as strong tentacles, of course, in South America with the Grace shipping line, with the CIA, with the labor unions, and a lot of hands into the fascist repressive governments in South America. And he's telling us now, Mr. J. Peter Grace, on how to save money for our ordinary domestic needs, but he's not throwing $1 million or $2 million on John DeLorean for no reason, and DeLorean was in heavy operations. Part of those operations are described in a chapter called The Golden Ring, and this describes DeLorean's behavior in early 1981. Keep in mind, in March 81, Reagan was shot, and Alexander Haig, a Knight of Malta, thought he was in charge of the White House, or would be under George Bush, whose brother is a Knight of Malta in the Vatican. And in March 81, the Pope was shot, and all hell broke loose and financial systems changed, because then the Masonic Lodge was exposed and the guns and narcotics traffic that linked to Henry Arsan in Syria. But this is the milieu of 81 that was going on at the time DeLorean was working with his companies. DeLorean formed what he called a maritime company. So did Klaus Barbie. They were going to lease ships and ship Mexican oil around the world. And he also sent an agent, Gene Caffiero, to Poland. This is a time when John Paul II was sending espionage money of $50 million to Lech Walesa and sending vehicles, or the plan to ship vehicles which weren't made, into Eastern Europe, which would be a wonderful excuse like the export-import for spying. Now, this is a direct quotation from the book. John planned to manufacture replicas of famous old cars in Italy. I knew he had strong Italian connections. The underwritings were planned for the production of an engine called the Sterling. For reasons John never explained, certain South Americans were using our credit cards, that were set up by J. Peter Grace and so forth, and phones, and oil shipments were being moved by our telex. John asked me to develop a privately operated intelligence service to accept assignments too embarrassing for governments to undertake. We would recruit mercenaries, plant spies, and other businesses. John raised the idea, and I responded, and he wrote me a letter spelling out in detail what he wanted. He also said that he thought the British would then try to kill him. He said, they're going to kill me. The British government doesn't hesitate. They employ hit squads to take out businessmen they dislike. I was so concerned on March 18th, 1981, I sent John a private note saying that a lot of people may be out to destroy you, to penetrate your secrets. Examine your court cases for negative testimony. Examine your financial affairs. And I would turn loose great reporters to do the story if I really wanted to hurt you. And so when the reporters got on DeLorean's case, he said they were hurting him. And then this book describes Colin Chapman, the great designer of auto motors, racing cars, who was working for DeLorean, who was in fact murdered. And I have the files or list of 6 people around DeLorean that died immediately in this time period as soon as he was arrested in Los Angeles and connected to their being ripped off, his associations of John DeLorean. So he blames the British has the hit squads, but he knows they're hit squads. And then this book describes, we paid $17 million into a Swiss account in connection with our work with Lotus Car. Lotus is Colin Chapman, who designed those Lotus engines. So they have never accounted for the $17 million, and that was supposed to be, I was told, the money that cash went from buying the cocaine in Los Angeles. The money would go into that account and was transferred to Mangley's account. Klaus Barbie didn't trust John DeLorean and wanted cash, and Barbie was quickly arrested when the government changed in Bolivia. And then DeLorean was arrested right after that, or pardon me, DeLorean was arrested first, and Barbie right after that, the first of the year in 1983, in January of 83. So in the news and in the books being published, if I wish I had more time to read more books, these new books are wonderful, are the connections of these various people and the primary witnesses and their attorneys. And the trials that I brought up several weeks ago and intermittently through the last year will continue, and I will update these characters. I wanted to go a little slower tonight, I hope I did, with some of the names involved, because they are pertinent in the fact that each one of them that I cited has a relationship to each other. You can't do it in 1 hour, but I will bring those knots a little tighter each week, and you'll be able to see the pattern of what I've referred to, the Odessa, and how it works, and how these court trials are bringing out the relationships between these people. Well, now the hour is up, and I'm going to turn the station over to David for some nice reggae. You can relax, and I hope one person calls up every week and subscribes. Otherwise, I will go on a strike. Some evening we'll have an hour of silent time. We'll try at our music. This is Mae Brussell. It's KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, and I'll be back with you next week.